Hey, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us here at Ivanti today for our webinar on the 2025 State of Cybersecurity Report, Balancing Risk and Reward. My name is Michael. I will just be guiding us through the first minute or two to go over a couple housekeeping items before I pass the mic over to Karl and Helen. So, timing wise, we should be roughly half an hour today, maybe a little over, but you can find a ton of great content related to today's topic, including the security report that we are predominantly here to discuss on the related content side panel that you'll see on the right of your screen there in Goldcast. So feel free to check that out after we're through. And any questions that you might have while we're talking today, please feel free to ask them as they come to you. We will be monitoring the chat for those throughout. And any questions that we don't get to live, we'll be sure to reach out after the session to try and help you out with those. So with that all said, I will kick it over to Karl now to get us started and proper. Thanks again, and hope you enjoyed today's session.
Great. Thank you, Michael. Very happy to be here today. Let me just introduce myself very quickly here. I'm Karl Triebes. I am the Chief Product Officer at Ivanti, and I have a long history working in the tech, within tech companies, but specifically cybersecurity. So I was previously over at ForcePoint and Imperva, as well as AWS and F5 Networks. So long history in cybersecurity. So no, I'm very excited to be here with Helen Yu today to talk about some of the interesting things that we're focused on here at Ivanti in cybersecurity. And I'll hand it over to Helen now to introduce herself.
Karl, great to see you again. And hello, everyone. I'm Helen Yu, founder of Tigon Advisory and host of CXO Spice. I also serve as a board director at CEC and Kinfolks and vice chairman of the Global Cybersecurity Association. Karl and I had an interesting conversation a while ago on how exposure management transforming cybersecurity risk management. So I am thrilled about opportunity to pick up this topic again and then reconnect and then hopefully have a deeper dive conversation on this topic today.
That's great, and excited to be here to have an opportunity to do that with you, Helen. And really the big focus, we talked about before was around exposure management, and how it's a foundational shift in how organizations view cyber risk, right? And it's not just in cyber risk in isolation, but it's providing, that large contextual view of cyber threats and how that pertains to risks within the organization and, taking into account, broader business objectives. So more specifically, exposure management is the practice of proactively and selectively identifying, assessing, and mitigating exposures across an organization's entire digital attack surface. And it involves, understanding possible access points and attack vectors, prioritizing the risks they present, and implementing measures to protect the most critical threats, right? And the ultimate goal is to maintain actual exposures at an acceptable risk level to the business. So Helen, maybe we ought to just talk a little bit more about how exposure management is different from vulnerability management, because I think the two get really confused. Exposure management takes a much more holistic, approach. So it's leveraging risk-based prioritization of exposures and validation of identified prioritized exposures to deliver, that comprehensive view of an organization's, entire digital attack surface, right? So it gives that full visibility of assets like servers, endpoints, mobile devices, IoT devices. And by the way, what's interesting with IoT devices, I'm just going to do an aside here, is that I remember going back about 5 or 6 years ago, the number one vector for botnets, bad botnets at that time, was cameras. These digital cameras, people, because they just weren't keeping them up to date, and that's still a big threat. These IoT devices actually are one of the big areas here that create these threats. But there's websites and the exposures they can create. So, and those, by the way, those include software exposures, missing patches, misconfigurations, weaker compromised credentials, and more. So it's a big attack surface. And the big question is, how do organizations get their hands around all this in a way that gives them that visibility, both from the business, what's the impact to the business, and what are the chances that these vulnerabilities will get exploited, right? And kind of marries those two concepts together. Hopefully that makes sense in terms of how that's being explained?
I agree with you. Carl. I've done many risk assessments for companies of different sizes in various industries. Most companies have a good understanding or basic understanding of their internal vulnerabilities, but challenged with risk associated with third party or suppliers oftentimes. One company, right, I worked with thought they had 350 endpoints. It turns out to be over 3,000 endpoints. And that kind of gap is not surprising, right, to you and people like us. So exposure management, as you said, considers shadow IT, third-party risks, misconfigurations, and interconnected vulnerabilities that may not individually score high, but collectively pose significant threats. Right. So this is why it's so important. This exposure management is so important and critical because it ties the technical risk to business outcomes, enabling organizations to prioritize actions effectively. Right. In the old way of just, hey, here's assessment, here's a report, here's all the vulnerabilities you have to take action upon, it's just not good enough anymore. Right. Exposure management points out exactly the action you need to take upon and then really guide you through that process. And to me, that's really why, and then also provides a continuous monitoring and a dynamic assessment of their attack surfaces. As you said, there are so many attack surfaces today. The camera today could be on a pair of sunglasses or it could be on a pair of shoes. So all those are, things have evolved. The way we live have evolved because of advancement of technology, and then just have the human eyes to really capture all these endpoints, moving parts is not enough anymore. It's not fast enough, right, to keep up with the ever-changing, the new world. And then the other thing you mentioned about it's really evolving, and hopefully it would be automated with AI integration in the longer term, right? That can help organizations to automate the task and catch things before the surface attack happens.
Yeah, those are such good points you're making there, especially on AI. Is that it's actually but it actually creates a bigger attack surface because AI obviously can find ways to mimic humans and do things like phishing or other attacks, or look for vulnerabilities and attack based on that. But they also can be a great tool for helping you better understand your attack surface and help digest some of this information. And that's really what it comes down to is getting that view or that visibility into that threat landscape in a way that's contextual to the business and the risks that you're willing to take in the business, right? And with that, there's four kind of essential principles with exposure management that tries to address just what you're talking about. One is, the first one was a great example of not understanding basically what are all your assets within the organization. And these assets can be internal, they can be external, they can be websites, they can be contractors, they can be a whole number of things. But any place on your digital landscape where there is software running is a potential exposure and a potential problem for you. And that those need to be taken into account. The other key differentiation, I would say, with exposure management is that this notion of risk-based prioritization, because there's a big difference between, say, looking at the level of a threat, meaning like you have a CVE, so a common, basically a critical vulnerability that NIST has, say, published. And let's say it gives a common vulnerability security score of 10, which is the highest there can be. Well, that may be that relates to the opportunity to exploit that vulnerability, but it doesn't take into account the actual risk to your infrastructure or your business, right? So you don't really know how to weigh that in with other vulnerabilities or things you're trying to address. And that's exactly what risk-based prioritization means. The other aspect that ties to that is this notion of like outcome-based metrics. So this is that kind of what you were saying is that kind of continual assessment. So, you look at your threat landscape, and then you look at, really the opportunities to be exploited, and then you take those outcomes and you feed that back in. So it's a closed loop. It's continually evolving as your threat surface evolves, and then it's providing you that information then to go off and deal with that. And then finally, which I think is super important, is that, and we talk a lot about this in the report, is this notion of silos within organizations. And you could have multiple silos. You can be generally a lot of times security is siloed away from, let's say, IT. That is, they're looking for threats and risks. They're using, they look at, in their narrow view, they're looking at, oh, well, what is the critical vulnerability score here, the CVSS score? What is its chance to be exploited? But they may not necessarily be fully and understand the business outcomes or what the business is trying to achieve. And likewise, IT is often focused more on building business logic into their systems and driving the business forward. And so there can be a decoupling. And then finally, when you start looking at, like, say, you have business units that are operating, they'll have different requirements and needs based upon what they're providing within that business, right? And that needs to be taken into account when you look at your overall threat landscape. And then finally, I think ultimately one of the other key points is that organizations have to decide what their risk tolerance is. And Helen, we can talk more about this because this is in the report. And this, remember, we said there was discussions around level 4 orgs that are much more evolved in their security practices than, say, like level 1 orgs. And in fact, the stat that I thought was interesting there is that you look at from the study was that 26% of level 4 orgs plan to increase investment, as opposed to only 16% of level 1 organizations.
Yeah, that's interesting, Carl. That actually caught my eyes, right? So why do you think there's such a big disparity in organizations' level of security awareness and maturity, right? Obviously, if we can become a level 4 organization, we all want to become a level 4 rather than level 1, right? I'd love to pick up your brain on that.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question on that. And that is, and there's a lot of theories around this, but I tend to look at, kind of how I experience things, and that is, the more I learn, the more I realize I don't know, and the more I get curious and start looking deeper and deeper. And I think that's what happens with more mature, or I should say, organizations which much more, mature programs around security, is that they've gone down that rabbit hole and start to realize, wow, yeah, there's a lot here, and I need to do a lot more to secure my business. And of course, there's regulatory requirements and things that may drive certain business to do certain things, but I think the awareness of these threats and where they can come from is growing, because you're seeing exploits all over the place, and organizations their businesses are being impacted. I mean, look what happened with MGM with that ransomware attack several years ago, where it shut them down for several days. You can only imagine how much revenue loss was happening with that. And I think there's also a recognition that attack surface, your digital asset attack surface, is much bigger than was previously realized, right? Being able to understand exactly what threats can come through endpoints, or let's go back to printers or other things that are attached or part of that network. And I just think as organizations mature, they get a better view of that, and then they create more processes around that, and then of course that drives then more awareness, and then as they discover more, then they build on top of that. So I just think it's kind of that journey that they go down.
One of my observation, right, is that organizations who really tie the align cybersecurity with their business outcomes or goals, those are the ones turn to be more, I would say, effective protecting themselves, right? For example, oftentimes if you purely just focus on cyber, trying to protect yourself, user experience could be satisfied, it could be sacrificed. However, if you think about business outcome, right? Think about what are the data we need to protect and why. Obviously customer data quite sensitive. If you're in a highly regulated industry, financial services or healthcare, you have to make sure not only protecting your internal data, but the patient data or your financial customers' data, all those are very important. But it's not just a checklist checking to really make sure they're protected, but you have to make sure you embed your cybersecurity strategy into your day-to-day business operations, right? That to me is a big difference. And then if you just go procure a cybersecurity tool without having a process in place to embed cybersecurity as a holistic strategy, that won't be effective either. So it's not just about a tool, it's about holistic cybersecurity strategy, making sure it's embedded into your day-to-day operation. One thing actually I came across business capability assessment Ivanti I find it very helpful. Can you help us? Can you share what that is and how you help companies really identify the gaps, build a roadmap, leveraging that business capability assessment tool?
Yeah, that's a good one. Yeah, so we have our Avanti's business capability assessment. And this is an online self-assessment anyone can take to test and visualize their maturity as an organization in exposure management, as well as service management, endpoint management, security. So anyone interested in looking at that, I would encourage them to visit, the Avanti.com website under exposure management. And they certainly, that'll guide them through that assessment. But it's quite eye-opening in many ways, because again, as you learn more, then you ask more questions, and then you find more things within your organization and how you address those. I think you made a really good point around being able to understand, have a business-driven metric around your threat surface. And that's what's been, I would say, lacking in traditional vulnerability management solutions, is that they tend to be much more technical focused, trying to address like specific CVEs or other things within your infrastructure, but not necessarily looking at the overall risk and helping you prioritize where you want to, where are the biggest risks and how do you address those in the context of the business. And that goes back to that scoring system that we have, being able to look at effectively what is your risk, based on your entire attack surface. And then how do I stack rank the areas that I need to address? And they may not be based on, say, the highest CVSS score or something else. They may be things with like poor credentials somewhere, account takeover attacks, things like that, can occur in those areas. And you want to make sure that you have strong credentials, things like, privilege escalation, within your infrastructure, other things like that are more subtle, but have a bigger impact, in terms of potential threats to your business. And so it's very critical to get that understanding in those business terms. And then with the, but once you kind of understand that overall risk and what's affecting that, then it's much easier then to go to either the individual business units or the IT groups and put a program in place to address those in the order without disrupting the business. It goes back to, security needs to be transparent for the most part to the users. They can't, if it becomes an impediment, they'll work around it, right? You see that happens. They'll find ways to get around it, because at the end of the day, the business needs to move at the velocity of the market and what they're trying to attain. And if security gets in the way, that tends to be the first thing that gets put aside. And so that's why it's so critical to have this set up in a way that flows with the business. The CISO speaks the language of the business. The board understands why and what we're doing and why the investment in security. And then the business units then understand why they're making those investments and why that's helping their business, right? So it all goes back to, how do I make my business work in the context of, what I'm trying to achieve, but also how am I staying secure?
Absolutely. I mean, you actually mentioned about data silo earlier, right? There is a big silo between IT and security team. And as a matter of fact, the State of Cybersecurity Report Ivanti had indicated 62% say silos slow security response times. 53% claim that silos weaken their organization's security posture. I'd like to unpack this a little bit with you. And then what can organization really do to address these data silos?
Yeah, I mean, silos are problematic and they create those blind spots, right? Basically, it creates a lack of empathy between the orgs. So that one doesn't really understand well what the other is trying to achieve and why. And then with that, then you don't get necessarily the right business outcomes. It all goes back to, what can I do to enable the business, right? And so, I think within the stat, I think 62% said silos, slow security response times. And then, this is between IT as well as, the security teams. And then, of course, again, 53 over half, claim silos weaken their organization's security posture. And it goes back to not speaking a common language, that is security, or not necessarily being empathetic or understanding of the business outcomes. So security, with security, I mean, you can just keep applying security. You can just go hard there and just keep doing things, based on your understanding of it, but you're not necessarily, prioritizing things in the right way that actually help the business, right? That are actually, necessarily taking out the biggest business risks. And likewise in IT, they don't necessarily understand what security is trying to achieve or do, because they don't see the full threat landscape or understand that picture. And so to break down these silos, one is that's why I think the risk-based scoring is so important, because you get that picture, and then being able to categorize or stack rank these vulnerabilities or these exposures, and look at the, where you're going to have the best leverage, then it makes it much easier than to, communicate and work together. But really what it ends is organizations need to kind of assess what's their overall risk, how do they think about risk, and where they have low risk organization, they're willing to take a lot of risk, and then based on that, then, the business outcomes will flow from that. And then of course, these teams need to work together then closely to ensure that they're meeting that risk, that overall risk posture that's being set by, the leadership of the company, right, or the organization. So these are all super important, I think, to break down those silos, and so these teams can work productively together and have that appropriate empathy. And I don't know the better way to say it than empathy, because I think at the end of the day that tends to be one of the biggest challenges. But it comes through understanding, what the organization's goals and outcomes, and then how they can work productively together.
And it doesn't really, IT may not see or understand what cybersecurity team does. Oftentimes, security team assumes everyone understand what needs to be done. It's just do just daily operation. So the difference between SOC team and NOC team could cause really major issue. As you said, this data silo organization really need to centralize, right? Have exposure management to really have the visibility to tell them like where they may have the vulnerability. So, really have a tool like what Ivanti has can accelerate the automation and making sure that organizations can prevent these things happening before they really happens. But one thing I do, you talk about risk appetite, right? I've been working with financial advisor. The first thing they ask me is, what is your, risk tolerance? They gave me assessment. All those I find is super helpful. I love to get your take on, especially I know Ivanti has a risk appetite statement template there, right? You can guide the organization to help them align their risk appetite with the actions they're taking. It would be really good to learn a little bit more about this framework and how you help organizations do so.
Yeah, yeah. So we're part of the CTEP, CTEM, um, uh, which is basically how we map to NIST CSF 2.0. And so there's a lot of interesting information there on how we handle things like with expanded scope, risk-based prioritization, and then outcome-based measurement. And this all ties to that framework. And again, going through kind of our, I would encourage them to go through our evaluation on the website, like I mentioned earlier, with respect to like risk appetite. That's very specific to an organization, right? So they need to set kind of what their risk tolerance is, and that is, it's how okay you are, if you will, with getting that greater risk to reward ratio. That is, how much investment do you need to put in security controls against that acceptable level, of residual risk. And so, and it must include the cost of like patching exposures, or, revising code, fixing misconfigurations, implementing other security measures, and potential business disruptions, right? So that all has to be evaluated. And that's why I think exposure management is a very useful tool, because it again gives you a much more holistic view of that overall risk, right, that you're actually incurring. And then you can then make investments and then see how that, how your risk score changes based upon that, right? So you can see where you're getting your leverage, and it gives you a better way to think about like what risks are you taking on? Because again, you can apply security controls all day long. You can spend all your time doing that, and ultimately, you're still going to be insecure. There's just, you can't guarantee the security. The only thing I know that's fully secure is a brick, and those aren't very useful in cyber, for most businesses other than maybe construction. So, so in any case, there's always going to be a risk reward ratio, and the organizations have to do that, right? And so that's just key.
There are also internal versus external factors, right? It could be organizational culture, industry regulations, financial stability. It could be geopolitics, right? All those could affect your risk. And then all those, as you said, the organization really need to really start with that first before you go make decisions on where you invest. But either way, exposure management should really give you that kind of at least help you understand where you have vulnerabilities and then where you should prioritize your investment in cyber risk management.
Yeah, absolutely. And that goes back to what I was saying earlier. That is, like the exploitability of, say, a vulnerability isn't necessarily correlated to its risk in terms of its exposure. That is, you could have something, again, with a very high score, like it's the CVSS score, but the opportunity to actually exploit that may be very low. Um, Likewise, you may have, like, say, several CVEs with moderate to low CVSS scores, but in conjunction, they wind up being very much exploitable and very much a high threat to your business, because maybe it's going to leak data or things like that. And so these are the things that the various tools within exposure management help you better understand, and then you can prioritize where you're making these fixes and changes, where you get the most leverage. And I think that's the key, right? Is where do you get the most leverage for your investment? And then how do you view that in the context of your overall business objectives?
Yeah, you're right. Even though you know the risk, and one of the critical challenges I see is divide between security and business leader, right? That's another side of silo, the communication risk, communicating that risk in terms of business impact is so critical as well. As a board member, the ability to communicate cybersecurity risk effectively is so critical for making informed decisions that align with business overall strategy. The challenge often really lies in the gap, right, between the security team's technical perspective and the board focus on business outcomes today. It's encouraging to see that 88% of CISOs now are invited to some high-level strategic meetings, indicating that security is increasingly being recognized as a fundamental part of decision making. I'd love to hear your perspective on the more of like importance around like the need for a common language around risk, right? What are the things that you think that we can do to kind of bridge that gap, and then how to really better like incorporate to align the risk?
Yeah, that's been a challenge, for boards specifically, is to understand what is their real posture with regards to their, their basically their, their exposure, right? And it can be everything from what are the business outcomes, and how they need to think about investments within the business to protect against, threats, if you will. But also other things that are more mundane, like how do I get cybersecurity insurance? That's been a big challenge as of late. Being able to put together those policies, and it's a big expense to organizations. And so the more the board can understand, the real threat landscape and the posture and what investments are needed to address that, the better off the organization is, because now you have board backing, and that really helps set the tempo, if you will, through the executive team down through the organization. The role of the CISO has changed, significantly in the last 10 years. I mean, I remember this going back to the days when IT used to be more of just a service function. And then over time, they became a business partner with a seat at the table, because those systems became so important for the operations of the business. They had to be a part of those decisions. Likewise, security has made that transition now, that everything has to be done in the context of security, in that the business has these risks, and those need to be addressed up front and at that highest level within the management team of the organization, right? So that's the big transition that's happened there. But as you pointed out, there hasn't been a great way for them to understand, really what that posture is. A lot of times they'll be, okay, well, let's say we patch on this interval, we're patching our systems every week, we're doing this, or every 2 weeks or whatever, or we're addressing CVEs here. But that doesn't necessarily mean anything to them. It's like, how do I attach that to the business? I don't really understand what that means. And that's why this risk-based scoring with exposure management really is helpful there, because you can look at your overall posture, you can understand where the critical threats are and how those are being addressed, and how that affects that overall risk score. And again, that they use that to kind of comport against what you've decided, what your risk appetite is for the organization, and that then sets the tempo. And then based on that, then you can continuously improve and see what the results are based upon those improvements and driving that score down.
Yeah, right on. That's why exposure management plays a pivotal role, right, by translating that technical risk metrics into business relevant insights. So that's really great to see. And then I think the lastly is the balancing risk and reward topic. You and I talked about this a little bit during our previous conversation. I love to hear a little bit more, right? There are two things we want to talk about: the security versus productivity, employee experience. Secondly, the cost versus rewards of mitigating risk. I'd love to hear your perspective on that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I'm sure we've all been in organizations where there was, I don't want to say draconian security policies, but security policies such that really impacted productivity, workflows, things like that. And organizations should seek to minimize that impact, on productivity. Security doesn't need to be a tax. But again, it goes back to what we were saying earlier, is that then it needs to be contextualized in, with the business. You need to understand, how the business needs to operate, and then work with those stakeholders within the business, then to implement effective security controls, that have that have a real impact, but not necessarily that are draconian, such that they affect, worker productivity. And I've lived in various regimes and worked through all that, and I can say that it's something you absolutely need to be focused on, because it can change very, quickly, based upon what the perceived threat landscape is versus what the real threat landscape really is. So what I think is key is that, security needs to prioritize what the impact might be from something as best they can, and then the business needs to understand then what that means in terms of their business risk. Again, we keep going back to that, and and then as they invest, what is the ROI going to be on those security investments? Because at the end of the day, the business is accountable for the outcomes, overall business outcomes. And security obviously has their responsibility to ensure that risk, that risk tolerance is being met, and that those are being appropriately addressed. And that's, in that whole assessment, right? So at the end of the day, the business teams own it, but the productivity and otherwise, and security has to have that empathy and understanding, and they have to speak that common language of risk, to work productively together, break down those silos.
I echo that. Karl, as a board member, two things that we usually ask to do. Number one is to weigh the need for robust security measures against the impact on productivity and employee experience. Secondly, we oftentimes task to ensure that the cost of mitigating risk are justified by long-term rewards, right? For example, addressing tech debt, replacing end-of-life software may require significant upfront investment, but the long-term benefit far outweigh the risks of security breaches, right? So tech infrastructure complexity, as 37% of the organization report, is a key challenge today. It's essential for board and then senior leadership to guide the organization toward a more strategic, informed approach to balancing these competing needs.
Yeah, I mean, I think you hit the nail on the head with tech debt. I mean, any organization that's been around a while will have tech debt. In fact, our report stats said 37% of orgs say tech infrastructure is too complex to uphold basic security measures, right? So that complexity tends to grow over time, and that creates that technical debt. And then if you look at further deeper and from the report, over half of orgs say they're still using end-of-life software. And so you can see, organizations are having a tough time kind of keeping up, and understanding where they need to apply, security measures, where they need to invest in their infrastructure or services that they're consuming. And often they don't have a good view of that in the picture, because, let's say you have a system that's running kind of in the background for 15 years, and that asset's been running, and maybe it hasn't been patched or kept up to date, but it's still running. You haven't had any issues, let's say, per se, or that you know about. But how do I know when I should look at that as a threat? How much of a threat is that really to everything, right? And they don't have that visibility, don't understand that, right? And that's, again, what your comments on the board is that, IT infrastructure, business infrastructure, everything, it's incredibly complex today. You may be using cloud-based services, you may have a combination on-prem, back-end databases, different authentication solutions, different ways to pay. I mean, you'll have a myriad of solutions in many cases. And so, seeing that entire digital landscape and translating it back up to something that board again can understand, you need to take out the complexity and relate it to something that they can see and say, oh, okay, this is what's happening to my business by virtue of me not taking these investments or doing this or upgrading my infrastructure and all that. And this represents a big threat there. So it gives them a way to kind of figure out how to balance these things, right?
Yeah, that's why exposure management is really essential, right, in helping organizations find the proper balance between security and operational efficiency.
Yeah, and it's again, it goes back to that holistic view of the attack surface, right? So, what's interesting is like IoT devices. Half the organizations reported their IoT devices, they'll manage will rise in 2025, and I think that's just natural. Is more, you want to enable the mobile, user, for example, and they have made multiple ways. They may have an iPad, they may have an iPhone or an Android device, or there may be other things they're attaching to their sensors that are being leveraged in their infrastructure, cameras, security, whatever. Those are just growing. At least with the Internet of Things, I can't remember what they were saying, but they're talking about what 2 billion connected devices, I think, something like that, in 2020, and you can only imagine what that looks like now. And think about all the connected devices you have at your house. If you look at that. Um, you know the other the other thing about that balance is that aggregated data, instead of looking at your data in different silos, you could alleviate those blind spots, because now you can contextualize across your entire infrastructure what's happening or what you're seeing or what's being added or where the threats are. And so that makes it much easier then to prioritize and address those. And then finally, what you can do based upon that kind of aggregated view is, again, goes back to being able to categorize risk based on your business impact and things like that. So the end result is a much more strategic role with security versus it being just another service that's trying to do things. It creates that opportunity for it to be the business partner, and not just kind of another thing that business has to work around or work with, but not necessarily in the context of moving that business forward.
Well, I've learned so much from you today, Karl. I'm sure things evolve all the time in cyber. I'm sure we have a lot more to talk about, maybe 6 months from now or a year from now. I look forward to doing that again with you.
Yeah, no, I'd love to talk again about some of these other things that we're working on. It's the thing I love about cybersecurity is it forces innovation, because the bad actors out there are certainly motivated. They come from multiple I should say multiple places, right? They could be nation state, they can be your basement hacker, it can be anything. But there's a lot of money to be made, and with that, there's a lot of attacks going on, and so it's so important and so interesting. So I guess I'll close out the meeting for today, and I want to thank everyone for joining us today. Any of the related content we mentioned you can find in the side panel, and be sure to send the on-demand version of this webinar over to your colleagues if you liked what you heard today. Again, thank you so much, Helen. Really enjoyed our time today again, and look forward again to talking to you in the future.